The truth did not disappear all at once. It thinned. It softened. It slipped between ordinary minutes until the silence felt intentional. They would later try to bury what happened to Madison Cole beneath paperwork and polite explanations, but the day it began did not look like a scandal. It looked like a missed phone call. Every parent knows the small tremor that travels through the chest when a child does not answer. It is not panic at first. It is a quiet rearranging of expectation. Madison Cole was 17, responsible, steady, the kind of girl who texted if she was 5 minutes late. That Tuesday afternoon, her phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Her mother assumed she was in class. By the 4th call, something inside her began to pull tight. From a distance, the house remained unchanged. Sunlight lay across the kitchen floor. The clock moved. The dog shifted near the back door. Nothing announced that the rhythm of their lives had already shifted. Third-person observers might have said it was too early to worry. But worry does not wait for permission. At 3:18 p.m., Madison was supposed to be walking out of Jefferson Ridge High School with her backpack slung over one shoulder, earbuds in, head slightly tilted the way she always listened to music. She had a dentist appointment at 4. She had confirmed it the night before. Her attendance record was clean. Her teachers described her as attentive, kind, composed. She had plans that weekend to visit her grandfather, Franklin Cole, to help him reorganize old photographs. There was nothing unfinished in her day. By 3:42 p.m., her phone stopped ringing entirely. Her mother called the school. The front office answered with the practiced calm of institutional reassurance. Yes, Madison had been marked present. Yes, classes had ended at the usual time. No, they had not seen anything unusual. Teenagers, they reminded her gently, sometimes leave campus without checking out properly. It happened. There was no need to escalate prematurely. The word prematurely lingered in the air long after the call ended. Her father drove to the school anyway. He did not speed. He obeyed traffic lights. He told himself there would be a simple explanation. Perhaps Madison had left with a friend. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps this was a lesson in patience. He parked in the visitor lot and walked toward the office with steady steps, his mind arranging possibilities into harmless shapes. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly. The administrative assistant smiled with a professionalism that suggested this was not the first anxious parent she had encountered. Madison was marked present in every class. No early dismissal. No nurse visit. No disciplinary note. Her last recorded classroom was English literature at 2:10 p.m. When he asked about hallway cameras, the assistant hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. The resource officer, she explained, could check footage if necessary. It would take time. There had been some minor technical issues that week. Nothing significant. Technical issues. By early evening, law enforcement had been notified. The responding officer listened carefully, took notes, and asked standard questions. Had Madison argued with anyone? Had she mentioned wanting to leave home? Was there a boyfriend? Any history of running away? The questions were procedural, not accusatory, but they carried an implication that settled heavily in the room. At 8:27 p.m., the incident was entered into the system as a possible runaway. The word felt misplaced. Madison did not slam doors. She did not disappear without a trace of intention. She wrote reminders on sticky notes and left them on the refrigerator. She hugged before leaving the house. She said good night. Franklin Cole arrived without urgency. He was 72, deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who read every page of a manual before assembling a bookshelf. He listened more than he spoke. He sat at the kitchen table while the officers finished their report, his hands folded loosely, his expression unreadable. When they left, he asked to see the timeline. He did not ask what they felt. He asked what they knew. Madison's last confirmed sighting, according to the school, was entering her English class at 2:10 p.m. At 3:05 p.m., dismissal bell. Between those times, nothing appeared unusual. Yet no one could confirm seeing her exit the building. No friend recalled walking with her. No bus driver marked her present. Her father returned to the school the next morning. The resource officer explained that several hallway cameras had experienced a malfunction between 2:17 and 2:43 p.m. The system had glitched. It was unfortunate timing. Maintenance had been notified. Unfortunate timing. Franklin asked for the maintenance logs. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply requested documentation. When the school hesitated, he nodded once, as if noting the hesitation itself. By late afternoon, a copy of Madison's attendance sheet was printed and handed over. Every class marked present. No gaps. No anomalies. She had been there. On paper, she existed in each room she was supposed to occupy. But there was no verified footage of her leaving the campus. No timestamp. No image. No record of departure. That night, the house felt altered in a way that was difficult to name. Her bedroom door remained slightly open. Her bed was neatly made. Her charger lay on the desk, unused. The silence was not loud. It was organized, almost careful, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Franklin sat at the table again, the attendance sheet spread before him. He traced the times with a steady finger. Present. 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 If Madison was present that day, why did every camera suddenly fail between 2:17 and 2:43 p.m.? By the third morning, the shape of the story had already begun to settle into something official. It moved through hallways and inboxes with the quiet confidence of procedure. Madison Cole was no longer described as missing in uncertain tones, she was described as a runaway teen. The label appeared first in a brief update from law enforcement, then in a short line within the local police bulletin. The phrasing was careful, measured, and designed to calm the community rather than alarm it. There was no accusation in the word, only a suggestion of teenage impulsivity, a temporary absence, a misunderstanding waiting to correct itself. Her mother read the word twice before it fully registered. Runaway implied choice. It implied frustration, rebellion, secrecy. It suggested something inside Madison that her family had somehow failed to see. The suggestion did not arrive loudly, it arrived with a polite shrug, as if it were the most reasonable explanation available. Friends began sending messages asking if Madison had been unhappy. Distant relatives called gently, wondering if there had been tension at home. The narrative was shifting, and it was shifting away from institutional responsibility. At the school, the guidance counselor offered a quiet observation that was later summarized in a report. Madison had seemed withdrawn in recent weeks. Nothing alarming, just quieter than usual. She had requested information about college applications out of state. She had asked about transferring credits. The notes framed these actions as subtle indicators of restlessness. Behavioral concerns, the summary read, though no formal documentation of misconduct existed. The phrase lingered in the margins of the file, undefined and unchallenged. An anonymous tip reached the police department by the end of the week. A caller claimed Madison had spoken about wanting to leave, about feeling constrained, about starting fresh somewhere new. The tip contained no specific location, no name of a friend, no concrete plan. It was an impression, offered without verification, yet it was entered into the system as corroborating information. The file thickened. The runaway narrative gained weight. Meanwhile, something else appeared online. Madison's social media account posted a brief message late Tuesday night, hours after her phone had stopped responding. The message was vague but optimistic, referencing new beginnings and personal space. It was written in a tone that felt slightly unfamiliar, not wrong exactly, but distant. Her mother stared at the timestamp, calculating the minutes, recalling the silence in Madison's bedroom at that very hour. The password had not been changed. The device itself was still missing. Franklin did not comment on the post. He asked instead for the metadata. Timeline inconsistencies continued to surface in small, almost forgettable ways. A teacher recalled seeing Madison in the hallway at 2:20 p.m., though the camera covering that corridor had reportedly malfunctioned at 2:17. A classmate insisted Madison had mentioned the dentist appointment again that afternoon, sounding entirely normal. The attendance log showed her marked present in her final class, but the digital record indicated the entry had been modified twice within 24 hours. The changes were subtle, a formatting adjustment here, a timestamp update there, but they were changes nonetheless. Franklin requested the incident reports formally, submitting written documentation rather than verbal inquiries. He asked for maintenance logs related to the camera system. He asked for copies of internal communication concerning the technical malfunction. The school district responded with partial compliance. Several pages arrived with black bars obscuring entire paragraphs. Redacted for privacy, the cover letter explained. Certain details were protected to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Integrity was a word that carried weight, but it also carried ambiguity. Weeks passed, and the school resource officer who had been on duty that afternoon was quietly transferred to another campus within the district. The transfer was described as routine, part of an annual personnel reshuffle. No connection to Madison's case was acknowledged. The district released a statement emphasizing its commitment to student safety and cooperation with law enforcement. The tone was calm, reassuring, and carefully detached from specifics. Her mother began speaking publicly, not angrily but steadily. She attended a school board meeting and asked simple questions about the cameras, about the overwritten attendance entries, about the social media post that did not feel like her daughter's voice. She did not accuse anyone. She asked for clarity. In response, officials reminded attendees that speculation could harm the investigation. They urged the community to trust the process and avoid spreading unverified theories. Speculation, it seemed, was the greater threat. Police reiterated their position that there was no evidence of foul play. They pointed to the anonymous tip, to the counselor's notes, to the absence of forced entry or visible disturbance. Teenagers leave home every day, they explained gently. Many return. It was important not to escalate unnecessarily. The classification remained unchanged. Franklin did not argue with the officers. He did not attend the board meeting. He remained at the kitchen table, organizing documents into chronological order, highlighting discrepancies, noting every alteration in digital records. He submitted a follow-up request for the full maintenance logs of the camera system, specifying the exact window between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. on the day Madison disappeared. He asked for the authorization history attached to any manual overrides. When the logs finally arrived, they appeared routine at first glance. System checks, minor software updates, routine inspections. But within the detailed entries was a notation that stood apart from the rest. At 2:16 p.m., 1 minute before the reported malfunction, the hallway camera outside Madison's last classroom had been manually powered down for servicing. The entry included a clearance code and a user identification number. Only one person had authorization to initiate that manual shutdown. Franklin Cole had spent most of his adult life studying structures that other people walked past without noticing. As a civil engineer, he understood that what held a bridge upright was rarely visible from the road. Strength lived in reinforcements, in calculations, in small details that determined whether something endured or collapsed under pressure. Long before Madison disappeared, he had developed a habit of reading the fine print on everything from warranty agreements to municipal bond proposals. He believed systems revealed themselves to those patient enough to examine their margins. Retirement had not softened that instinct. His garage shelves were lined with labeled binders organized by year, each containing neatly filed tax returns, utility statements, repair receipts, and correspondence. He kept duplicate digital copies stored on encrypted drives. It was not paranoia. It was discipline. He trusted documentation more than memory because paper did not reinterpret itself in moments of stress. When the maintenance log revealed that a hallway camera had been manually powered down at 2:16 p.m., Franklin did not react outwardly. He did not speculate about motive. He wrote the time down in blue ink and circled it once. Then he began building outward from that minute, the way an engineer begins with a foundation and works up toward the surface. He filed formal Freedom of Information Act requests for every document related to the school's security system maintenance during the month of Madison's disappearance. He submitted preservation letters to the district's legal office, requesting that all digital records, internal emails, and archived backups be retained in their original form. The language he used was respectful but firm. He cited statutory obligations. He attached copies of prior correspondence. He gave them no reason to dismiss him as emotional. He visited the county clerk's office on a quiet Thursday morning and requested property records for the empty lot adjacent to the school's eastern boundary. The lot had been fenced temporarily the week Madison disappeared, though no public announcement had been made about construction. Franklin did not assume significance, he gathered context. The property had recently changed hands, transferred to a development group with ties to a subcontractor that serviced multiple municipal buildings in the district. At home, he began tracking badge numbers. Every officer who had visited the house, every staff member listed in the incident report, every maintenance supervisor whose name appeared in the logs was written onto a large corkboard mounted in his study. Thin lines of red string connected dates, timestamps, and job titles. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. He was not building a conspiracy. He was building a timeline. A zoning complaint filed 1 week before Madison vanished caught his attention. A nearby resident had reported unauthorized equipment being stored behind the school after hours. The complaint had been marked resolved within 24 hours, though no follow-up notes explained how. Franklin requested the resolution documentation. The clerk promised to retrieve it. Patience, he reminded himself, was not passive. It was strategic. The contractor responsible for installing and maintaining the hallway cameras was listed in the district's procurement records. Franklin requested copies of the original service agreement and the most recent invoice summaries. When the documents arrived, he reviewed them line by line, comparing them against the maintenance logs already in his possession. Most entries aligned predictably: quarterly inspections, software updates, minor repairs. Nothing overtly suspicious. And yet, small discrepancies in formatting began to stand out. An invoice number slightly out of sequence. A service description that lacked its usual detail. He noticed that the digital timestamps on several invoices did not match the internal system logs. The invoices indicated service confirmations hours before the corresponding maintenance activity appeared in the system record. It could have been clerical error. It could have been delayed data entry. Franklin did not jump to conclusions. He marked the inconsistencies with a yellow tab and moved on. Throughout this process, he did not confront anyone. He did not call the contractor to demand explanation. He did not accuse the district of negligence. He understood that premature confrontation could alert others to weaknesses in their own documentation. Instead, he allowed the record to expand quietly, trusting that patterns would emerge without pressure. In the evenings, he updated the timeline board in his study. Madison's last confirmed classroom entry at 2:10 p.m. The camera shut down at 2:16. The reported malfunction window from 2:17 to 2:43. The pump activation behind the school at 3:12. The social media post later that night. Each event was written in black marker, evenly spaced, unemotional. He stepped back often, studying the board the way he once studied blueprints, searching for structural misalignment. What steadied him most was not anger but clarity. Grief could cloud judgment, but documentation offered a form of grace. It allowed him to act without raising his voice. It allowed him to honor Madison not through outrage but through precision. He believed that truth, like architecture, required alignment. If enough measurements were taken, the distortion would reveal itself. One afternoon, as he compared the contractor's invoice summary against the detailed maintenance log, he found a single entry that tightened the pattern. The invoice listed a service call at Jefferson Ridge High School on the day Madison disappeared. The time recorded was 2:31 p.m. The description was brief: system adjustment. No elaboration. Franklin leaned back in his chair and looked again at the timeline board. 2:31 p.m. fell directly within the window when the hallway cameras had reportedly malfunctioned. It was also the minute that no witness could account for Madison's movement between classrooms and the exit corridor. The alignment was too precise to ignore, yet too subtle to declare as proof. He did not allow himself to assume guilt. He allowed himself only one conclusion: the story on record was incomplete. The contractor's invoice listed a service call at 2:31 p.m., the exact minute Madison disappeared. Franklin Cole understood something most people preferred not to consider: when stories do not align above ground, the truth often settles somewhere beneath it. He had spent decades calculating how water moved under streets and how soil shifted under weight. He knew that land remembered disturbance even when people did not. And so, when the timeline tightened around a narrow window of silence, his attention moved naturally toward the physical landscape behind Jefferson Ridge High School. The rear of the campus bordered a narrow stretch of undeveloped property, partially wooded and partially cleared months earlier for what had been described as future improvements to drainage infrastructure. Franklin retrieved construction permits from the county database and spread them across his dining room table. The permits had been pulled 6 months before Madison disappeared, authorizing excavation for a temporary drainage line upgrade and installation of a high-capacity pump. The paperwork appeared routine, stamped and approved with municipal efficiency. But timelines mattered. The permit authorized work during summer break, yet inspection notes showed activity resumed briefly the week Madison vanished. Temporary fencing had been installed along the back perimeter of the school just days before her disappearance. No public notice had been issued to parents about resumed construction. No visible heavy machinery remained afterward. The fence had been removed quietly within 2 weeks. Franklin did not speculate. He compared dates. The subcontractor listed on the drainage project was not the same company that maintained the cameras, but he recognized the name from school board meeting minutes. The company's owner had contributed to several local campaigns, including that of a board member who had recently advocated for expanded campus security upgrades. The connection was not illegal. It was not even unusual. But patterns formed in proximity, and proximity deserved examination. He requested archived weather data for the afternoon Madison disappeared. As an engineer, he trusted environmental records. They did not bend under pressure. The data showed clear skies, mild wind, no measurable precipitation. There had been no storm, no flooding event, no emergency that required immediate drainage intervention. Yet the pump installed behind the school activated at 3:12 p.m., according to the system logs attached to the permit file. Franklin circled the time carefully. If there had been no rain, what triggered the pump? He requested clarification from the district's facilities department. The response arrived in the form of a brief statement explaining that the pump sometimes activated automatically during routine calibration cycles. The explanation sounded reasonable, almost technical enough to discourage further inquiry. But when Franklin compared that statement against the manufacturer's manual, he noted that calibration cycles were scheduled in advance and recorded separately from emergency activations. The 3:12 entry was logged as manual engagement. After his public records request regarding the drainage system, subtle changes appeared in the security logs he had previously received. A revised version was emailed to him, correcting minor typographical errors and clarifying timestamps. The camera malfunction window remained the same, but a notation referencing external maintenance coordination had been removed. It was presented as a formatting correction. Franklin did not protest. He saved both versions side by side. He did not accuse anyone of altering records. He simply archived the discrepancies. Recognizing the limits of paperwork alone, Franklin hired an independent land surveyor under the pretense of evaluating potential water flow concerns on the adjacent private lot. He paid out of pocket. He avoided publicity. The surveyor, a quiet professional accustomed to boundary disputes and soil grading assessments, conducted a routine visual inspection first. Nothing appeared remarkable at surface level. The ground was flat, recently leveled, seeded with new grass that had begun to take root. Franklin requested a ground-penetrating radar scan, authorized by the private property owner who had grown curious about the recent activity behind the school. The equipment arrived on a cool morning, its antenna gliding slowly across the soil in measured passes. Radar scans did not provide dramatic revelations, they produced patterns of density and disturbance that required interpretation. The surveyor reviewed the data twice before speaking. Beneath the recently seeded section of ground, approximately 20 yards from the back entrance of the school, the soil composition shifted abruptly in a rectangular formation. The disturbance was consistent with excavation and refill rather than natural settling. The edges were clean. The depth was uniform. Franklin listened without interruption. He did not ask the surveyor to speculate about purpose. He asked only for a written report detailing the measurements, soil compaction differences, and estimated timeline of disturbance based on moisture retention and layering patterns. The report would take several days. When it arrived, the language was restrained and technical. Anomalous soil displacement detected. Consistent with recent excavation. Estimated refill within a 2-week window prior to scan. No indication of natural erosion or animal activity. The measurements were precise, clinical, unemotional. Franklin placed the report on his timeline board and stepped back. Grief had taught him that anger could distort perception, but documentation created clarity. He felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication. Only a quiet tightening in his chest as the pieces aligned more closely than before. The camera shut down. The unexplained service call. The pump activation without rainfall. The temporary fencing. The soil disturbance. Still, he made no accusation. He forwarded copies of the radar findings to his attorney and submitted a formal request for supervised excavation under county oversight. He cited environmental compliance concerns rather than criminal suspicion. He allowed the system to move at its own pace, trusting that procedural pressure would carry more weight than public outrage. In the evenings, he sat alone in his study, looking at Madison's photograph pinned near the edge of the board. He did not imagine scenarios. He did not rehearse blame. He practiced patience, believing that truth, like groundwater, rose slowly but inevitably when given enough space. The surveyor's report ended with a detail that lingered longer than the rest. The disturbed soil measured 6 feet long and was filled just days after Madison vanished. Franklin Cole did not believe in dramatic breakthroughs. He believed in accumulation. One document rarely changed a system, but a pattern of documents could shift its foundation. Over several weeks, he assembled a binder thick enough to rest heavily in his hands, each section separated by labeled tabs, each page copied twice. It was not a display of suspicion. It was a quiet assertion that facts, when aligned, carried their own weight. The first section held Madison's attendance logs, printed in both their original and revised formats. He highlighted the subtle timestamp modifications and the overwritten entries that had been explained away as clerical corrections. The second section contained maintenance records for the hallway cameras, including the manual shutdown at 2:16 p.m. and the unexplained service call at 2:31. The third section documented the drainage pump activation at 3:12 p.m., paired with the certified weather data confirming clear skies that afternoon. The fourth section held the contractor's invoice summaries, their time discrepancies marked with small adhesive flags. The final section contained the independent soil scan report, its language restrained but unmistakable in its implications. He reviewed the binder not as a grieving grandfather but as an engineer reviewing a structural report. Each element alone might be rationalized. Together, they resisted coincidence. When the binder felt complete, he submitted copies to the state oversight agency responsible for educational compliance and public infrastructure accountability. His cover letter did not accuse. It outlined discrepancies, cited statutes, and requested independent review. He included a timeline that linked camera malfunction, service invoice, pump activation, and soil disturbance without inserting interpretation. He trusted that careful presentation would carry further than outrage. Simultaneously, he notified the school district's insurance carrier, attaching documentation suggesting potential procedural irregularities that could implicate liability. Insurance companies, he knew, examined risk with an intensity that institutions sometimes avoided. He did not frame the notification as adversarial, he framed it as precautionary. A week later, an anonymous email arrived in his inbox from an address created that morning. The sender attached a partial staff memo dated 2 days after Madison disappeared. The memo instructed faculty to direct all external inquiries to the district communications office and to refrain from discussing what it referred to as the drainage matter. The phrasing was clinical, almost detached, but its existence acknowledged internal awareness of something more specific than a runaway classification. Franklin printed the memo and placed it in a new section of the binder titled Internal Communications. He did not attempt to identify the sender. He responded only with a brief message expressing appreciation for the information and reminding the anonymous source to preserve any additional records. At the next school board meeting, administrators reiterated their commitment to transparency while declining to elaborate on ongoing investigations. They emphasized the importance of protecting student privacy and avoiding rumor. The word rumor began to feel like a shield. The district attorney's office responded to Franklin's submission with a measured letter acknowledging receipt of materials but declining immediate action pending further review. The letter contained language about insufficient evidence of criminal conduct at that stage. It was neither dismissive nor supportive. It was procedural, which Franklin understood as a beginning rather than an end. Local media outlets initially showed little interest. A missing teenager classified as a runaway did not command sustained headlines. Reporters returned calls politely but hesitated to pursue a story built on document discrepancies rather than visible scandal. Without a public accusation or dramatic revelation, the narrative lacked urgency. Franklin did not criticize them. He knew institutions moved when pressure accumulated, not when one person insisted. He filed a formal preservation motion through his attorney, requesting that the court order the district to retain all digital backups, server logs, and archived emails related to security and facilities operations during the relevant period. The motion cited concerns about potential data alteration, referencing the revised security logs he had received after his initial public records request. It was not an allegation of misconduct. It was a safeguard. Weeks passed with little outward change. Yet internally, subtle shifts occurred. The oversight agency requested additional clarification from the district. The insurance carrier initiated its own inquiry. Staff members were reminded again, through internal communication, to avoid discussing operational matters outside official channels. Then another document surfaced. Within a batch of emails produced under the preservation order, Franklin found a thread between 2 administrative officials dated the afternoon Madison disappeared. The exchange was brief, consisting of logistical updates and one phrase that did not fit its context. "We need to contain narrative before it spreads," one line read. There was no elaboration, no overt admission, but the language suggested awareness not of a runaway teen but of perception management. Franklin read the phrase several times, not with anger but with a steady, measured breath. Contain narrative implied that a story existed beyond the official version. It implied an understanding that something required framing. He forwarded the email thread to his attorney and to the oversight agency without commentary. 2 days later, law enforcement quietly reclassified Madison's case from runaway to suspicious circumstances pending further review. The change was not announced publicly, but it appeared in the internal case status accessible to attorneys. It was a subtle shift, yet it altered the trajectory of the investigation. Suspicion invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited disclosure. Franklin did not celebrate the reclassification. He returned to his study and updated the timeline board, adding the date of the status change. He understood that progress in systems rarely arrived with fanfare. It arrived in footnotes, in revised case codes, in archived emails. Among the newly released documents, however, one entry drew his attention for what it lacked. An email referenced in a reply chain was missing from the production set. The subject line appeared in the header, but the content itself was absent, replaced by a notation indicating deletion prior to archive extraction. Most deletions vanished quietly. But this one had left a trace. One internal email was deleted, but archived on the district's backup server. Systems are designed with redundancy, Franklin often reminded himself. Engineers anticipate failure. They build secondary supports in case the primary structure falters. Digital systems are no different. When one server fails, another preserves its memory. The weakness in most institutions is not absence of data, but assumption that no one will look for the copy. It was an insurance auditor who mentioned it in passing during a routine clarification call. The school district, she explained, outsourced its long-term digital storage to a third-party cloud archiving service to comply with state retention laws. Emails, security footage metadata, and server logs were mirrored nightly onto remote backup servers. The information was not immediately accessible through standard requests. It required formal legal retrieval. Franklin wrote the company's name in his notebook without expression. Through a civil petition filed by his attorney, he requested a narrowly tailored subpoena for archived metadata related to hallway camera activity between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m. on the day Madison disappeared. The petition did not accuse the district of concealment. It stated simply that discrepancies between primary logs and maintenance invoices warranted verification against backup archives. The language was precise and unemotional, grounded in procedural necessity. The judge approved limited retrieval. Weeks passed before the archived files arrived, encrypted and accompanied by certification of authenticity. Franklin sat at his desk as his attorney's forensic consultant extracted the metadata into readable form. The files were technical, dense with timestamps and system identifiers. But within the structured data was something the revised maintenance logs had omitted. The hallway camera outside Madison's final classroom had not fully malfunctioned at 2:17 p.m. It had recorded 12 minutes of footage before the feed terminated. The primary server copy showed only an error message beginning at 2:17. The archived metadata, however, confirmed continuous recording until 2:29 p.m., when the file abruptly truncated midstream. The footage itself had been partially preserved in compressed backup fragments. Reconstruction was incomplete but sufficient to outline movement. Franklin did not speak as the consultant played the restored segment. At 2:18 p.m., Madison exited her classroom carrying her backpack, walking at an unhurried pace. She did not appear distressed. Her posture was upright, her expression neutral, the ordinary composure of a student transitioning between classes. At 2:20 p.m., the school resource officer entered the frame from the opposite corridor. He approached Madison. The angle did not capture conversation, but their interaction appeared brief and controlled. After a moment, she adjusted her backpack strap and began walking beside him. They turned toward the maintenance corridor door located near the rear of the building. The footage cut at 2:29 p.m. There was no sign of struggle. No visible urgency. Only a quiet redirection from a public hallway into a restricted area rarely used by students. Franklin watched the final frame several times, studying the officer's body language, the position of the door handle, the lighting in the corridor. He felt no surge of anger, only a deep, steady ache that settled behind his ribs. Madison had not run away. She had walked, guided by someone entrusted with her safety. The timeline aligned with measured precision. At 2:31 p.m., the contractor's invoice recorded a service call. At 3:12 p.m., the drainage pump activated. the sequence was not chaotic. It was sequential. Within days of the subpoena's execution, the school resource officer submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons. The district released a brief statement thanking him for his service. No connection to the ongoing review was acknowledged publicly. The contractor responsible for the camera system maintenance closed its local office and relocated operations to another state. The move was described as a strategic business decision. Franklin documented each development without commentary. He forwarded the reconstructed footage to law enforcement through his attorney, accompanied by certification from the forensic consultant confirming the authenticity of the archived metadata. The case, already reclassified as suspicious, shifted quietly into active criminal investigation. Detectives requested additional records from the contractor and facilities department. Interviews were scheduled. Subpoenas extended. Still, Franklin avoided theatrics. He did not release the footage to media. He did not attend press briefings. He understood that public spectacle could complicate prosecution. His objective was not exposure, it was accountability through process. With the archived evidence in hand, he formally filed a request for supervised excavation of the soil anomaly identified behind the school. This time, the request cited probable cause supported by recovered security footage and corroborating maintenance records. The county approved the excavation under controlled conditions, scheduling it with forensic oversight. The morning the excavation began, Franklin stood at a distance beyond the temporary barrier erected around the site. The air was cool, the sky overcast but calm. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. Only measured movements of personnel trained to document every layer of soil with care. As equipment carefully removed the top layer of recently seeded grass, Franklin felt an unfamiliar softness enter his resolve. He had pursued documentation with relentless clarity, yet standing before the disturbed earth, he allowed himself to hope for answers more than conclusions. Hope did not deny the possibility of grief, it simply made space for truth. Hours passed before the excavation team signaled discovery. A section of soil, compacted differently from the surrounding earth, revealed material inconsistent with natural sediment. The team worked slowly, brushing away layers rather than tearing through them. Every motion was deliberate, respectful. From his vantage point, Franklin could see only shapes and muted colors. He did not move closer. He trusted the process he had set into motion. Excavation revealed something wrapped in construction tarp. The excavation site was closed to the public within hours, but confirmation did not remain private for long. Forensic analysis required patience, and patience became the language of the following weeks. There were no dramatic announcements, no rushed conclusions. Evidence was catalogued, transported, examined under controlled conditions. Soil samples were matched. Fibers were identified. Digital timestamps were cross-referenced against movement logs and archived metadata. The process unfolded with clinical steadiness, the way truth often does when it is allowed to move through proper channels. When the forensic report was finalized, it confirmed what Franklin had prepared himself to accept without ever speaking aloud. The construction tarp, consistent with materials logged in the drainage project inventory, had concealed remains buried within the timeframe established by the soil analysis. Identification was established through dental records and DNA comparison. Madison Cole had never left the campus grounds that afternoon. The official reclassification of her case shifted from suspicious circumstances to homicide investigation, though the language in early filings remained measured and restrained. The district attorney's office, now operating with documented evidence rather than inference, presented affidavits to a judge outlining probable cause. Arrest warrants were issued quietly but decisively. The former school resource officer was taken into custody without incident. The contractor responsible for camera maintenance faced charges related not to violence, but to evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. Investigators cited altered logs, manipulated timestamps, and coordinated deletion of digital files. The charge of abuse of authority was filed against the officer, rooted in the misuse of his position to isolate Madison under false pretenses. There were no televised chases, no confrontations. Only paperwork, signed and processed with the gravity it deserved. The superintendent of Jefferson Ridge High School was placed on administrative leave pending review of internal communications. Emails referencing the need to contain narrative were entered into evidence, not as proof of direct involvement, but as indication of institutional awareness that the official account required management. The school board announced cooperation with investigators and expressed sorrow for the community. The tone was somber, stripped of earlier reassurances. Franklin did not attend the arrests. He did not position himself outside the courthouse. When reporters requested interviews, he declined with brief statements thanking law enforcement for their diligence and asking for privacy. He understood that public anger might satisfy immediate emotion but could complicate legal clarity. His objective had never been spectacle. It had been process. Court documents became accessible to the public through standard filing procedures. Affidavits detailed the sequence of events reconstructed through footage, invoices, and archived backups. They described how the hallway camera had been manually disabled, how the maintenance corridor door had been accessed, how pump activation coincided with digital silence. The language remained procedural, yet within its structure lay undeniable weight. The contractor entered into a plea agreement on reduced charges, acknowledging participation in falsifying maintenance records in exchange for cooperation. His testimony, recorded under oath, outlined conversations with the officer regarding camera adjustments and temporary system overrides. He did not claim to understand the full scope of events at the time. He admitted, instead, to choosing compliance over inquiry. The former officer was indicted on multiple counts, including evidence tampering, obstruction, and abuse of authority. The indictment did not describe graphic acts. It described violations of trust, deliberate misrepresentation, and calculated manipulation of institutional safeguards. The legal framing emphasized betrayal of duty rather than sensational detail. Civil proceedings followed. Madison's parents filed a lawsuit against the district for negligence and failure to preserve evidence. The filing did not seek vengeance, it sought acknowledgement of systemic failure and financial provision for reform. Insurance carriers negotiated settlements with language that balanced accountability and mitigation. Policy revisions were drafted even before the trial concluded. Throughout the proceedings, Franklin remained composed. He attended hearings quietly, sitting in the second row, hands folded in his lap. He did not glare at the defense table. He did not react visibly when testimony recounted the timeline he had reconstructed months earlier. His restraint was not indifference. It was discipline shaped by love. Justice did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated through motions, hearings, cross-examinations, and judicial rulings. Evidence entered into record carried more weight than accusation. Emails once buried in backup servers were projected onto courtroom screens. Metadata timestamps were explained to jurors in careful language. Systems that had been manipulated were dissected openly. In the midst of proceedings, there were glimpses of remorse. The contractor, during sentencing, expressed regret for prioritizing instruction over conscience. The words were measured, perhaps strategic, yet they carried a tremor of recognition that choices had consequences beyond contracts. Whether forgiveness would follow was not a matter for the courtroom. The superintendent eventually resigned. The district announced comprehensive review of security protocols and digital retention policies. Transparency committees were formed. Public trust, once assumed, now required rebuilding. When verdicts were delivered, they came without applause. The officer was found guilty on counts of obstruction and abuse of authority. Sentencing would follow guidelines, calibrated to statute rather than outrage. The courtroom remained quiet as the judge read the decision. The gravity of it did not require embellishment. Franklin stepped outside into the late afternoon light, feeling neither triumph nor collapse. He felt completion of a cycle he had never wished to begin. Madison's absence remained unchanged, but the distortion around it had been corrected. Truth, once buried beneath altered logs and polite statements, now stood in official record. Yet as proceedings moved toward final sentencing, one detail continued to surface in testimony without full clarity. Emails hinted at conversations not fully documented. Decisions about narrative management appeared coordinated, but no single directive had been traced conclusively to its source. Justice had unfolded slowly, publicly, legally. But one question remained: who ordered the cover-up? When the verdict settled into the public record, it did not close the matter, it widened it. State investigators expanded their review beyond a single campus, examining procurement practices, digital retention policies, and administrative communications across the district. What began as one family's quiet insistence on clarity became a broader inquiry into how institutions protect themselves when truth feels inconvenient. The tone of the investigation remained measured, but its scope carried weight. Oversight was no longer internal. It was external, structured, and accountable. A temporary oversight committee was established by the State Education Board, composed of compliance officers, digital forensic specialists, and community representatives. Their mandate extended beyond assigning blame. They were tasked with rebuilding trust through structural reform. Public hearings were scheduled not to dramatize the past, but to redesign safeguards for the future. Parents filled the auditorium with subdued attentiveness, listening not for scandal but for assurance that systems could evolve. Policy reforms followed with deliberate pacing. Camera maintenance procedures were rewritten to require dual authorization for manual shutdowns. Digital archives were mandated to maintain independent audit trails accessible to state regulators without local mediation. Automatic alerts were instituted for unexplained data deletions. What had once been optional redundancy became required transparency. The reforms were not presented as punishment, they were framed as correction. Legislators took notice of the archival gap that had nearly allowed the footage to vanish. Within a year, a state law was passed requiring public schools to maintain third-party archival access under standardized retention protocols. The legislation did not bear Madison's name publicly at first, but those involved in drafting it understood the origin of its urgency. Mandatory archival transparency became part of compliance language across districts, reshaping how digital memory was preserved. The next school board election brought quiet turnover. Candidates campaigned less on promises and more on accountability. Voters who once attended meetings casually now read agendas carefully. The culture shifted from assumption to inquiry. Trust, once automatic, became earned. No rallies celebrated the change. It occurred through ballots and certifications, the steady mechanisms of civic response. In the midst of structural reform, Madison's name returned to the community in a different form. A scholarship fund was created in her honor, dedicated to students pursuing engineering, digital forensics, or public service. The criteria emphasized integrity and patience, qualities her grandfather embodied throughout the process. The first recipient stood at a podium months later, speaking softly about responsibility and quiet courage. There was no spectacle. Only acknowledgement. Franklin attended the ceremony but did not sit in the front row. He preferred the middle, where he could observe without being observed. When the student thanked Madison's family for transforming loss into opportunity, he lowered his eyes briefly, absorbing the words without display. He had never sought recognition. The scholarship felt less like tribute and more like continuation. After the legal proceedings concluded fully and civil settlements were finalized, Franklin returned to routines that had once felt ordinary. He organized his study, carefully archiving the binder that had grown thick with months of documentation. He did not discard it. He labeled it, dated it, and placed it alongside decades of personal records. The board with red strings was dismantled piece by piece. The cork remained, empty but intact. There was no celebration dinner. No press tour. No interviews reflecting on victory. Justice, as it had unfolded, required no embellishment. Madison's room remained as it had been, not preserved in frozen time but gently maintained. Her mother began volunteering at the scholarship committee. Her father planted a small tree in the backyard, its growth marking seasons that continued whether invited or not. Franklin spent more afternoons walking the perimeter of his property, listening to the sound of wind through leaves. He did not replay courtroom testimony in his mind. He allowed himself instead to remember Madison's quiet laugh, the way she organized photographs by year without being asked. Grief did not vanish. It softened, shaped by acceptance rather than resistance. Occasionally, letters arrived from parents in other districts who had heard about the archival reforms. They thanked him for demonstrating that persistence could correct systems. He responded briefly, encouraging them to document carefully and to remain patient. He did not offer strategy beyond that. The lesson was not confrontation. It was consistency. In the years that followed, the story of what happened behind Jefferson Ridge High School entered community memory not as scandal but as turning point. Policies bore the imprint of a grandfather who refused to let inconsistencies dissolve into silence. Administrators across the state attended training sessions referencing the case as example of procedural vigilance. The narrative had shifted from concealment to reform. Franklin understood that truth rarely announces itself with thunder. It moves through timestamps, through invoices, through soil layers and backup servers. It persists in small details others overlook. It waits for someone patient enough to read it without fear. He never spoke publicly about forgiveness, yet in private moments he recognized that holding anger would not honor Madison's memory. Accountability had been established. Systems had been corrected. What remained was the quieter work of living forward without surrendering what had been learned. They thought burying her would end the story. They underestimated a man who never stopped digging.